gentlemen. First of all, can I apologise for us being bumped yet again, if that's the right expression. As you know, we are very dependent on the goodwill of the Science Museum because we don't actually pay. And so if they get paying clients, I'm afraid, in fact, the man who has been so good to us, the head of the computer collections, Doran Swade, I'm delighted to say, has been promoted recently to being assistant director and head of all the collections, I think, in the museum. I'm glad to hear that, because I personally think it says a great deal for the management of the Science Museum that they are prepared to put up with people like Doran, who is certainly far more interested in his collections than he is in being Thatcherite correct, or whatever the expression is. Anyway, maybe in his new position he will be able to put slightly more damping into the being bumped out of the lecture room. We shall see. Well now, can I just say that Donald Michie and Jean, his wife, would be very pleased to join with us for a meal afterwards in the usual Italian restaurant, Soros, is it, or something like that, near Sugo's, near South Kensington Tube Station. Can I just get a show of hands for those who might like to join with us? Okay. Well, that's about within the tolerance I gave them. If you're not sure where it is, join with us when we stroll along after the meeting. Well now, let me come straight to this afternoon's speaker. Professor Donald Michie is one of those very extraordinary people who has made his mark on society in a variety of different, but perhaps related ways, if you can sort of really look deep enough to see the relationship. He started to become prominent at an extraordinarily young age. He joined Bletchley Park in, I think, 1942, when I guess he was probably 18 or something like that. Probably the youngest of the code breakers, certainly one of the youngest. There he worked, I believe, in both the testery under Major Tester, which was the manual approach, and then with Max Newman in, of course, the Newmanry, which was the machine approach to breaking the fish codes. So he had a hand in both camps, and as we shall no doubt hear, became a good friend of Alan Turing. After the war, he appears as director of the experimental programming unit at Edinburgh, I think in 1962 or thereabouts, but then becomes before that, he'd appeared as the senior lecturer, wait for it, senior lecturer in surgical science at the University of Edinburgh, 1958 in fact, before he became director of the experimental programming unit. And of course he went on to become the chairman and the director of the Department of Machine Intelligence and effectively made his name. I always think of him whenever I visit an AI centre around the world, because you can be quite certain that you find the Michie children there. In a sense, he has populated the world in one way or another with people interested in artificial intelligence. I'd just like to pick up one other of the remarkable things that he's done in his time. He battled to establish the Turing Institute and other affairs related to Turing's name against, I think, indifference more than anything over many years, and finally succeeded in establishing the Turing Institute in 1984. He must have been one of the key people in turning the tide to get the respect for he certainly deserves. Anyway, enough of me and Donald.
I think I should first just inject some additional material. I have now 9 grandchildren in the biological sense. Also, my first career was as a biologist, in fact an experimental biologist. All 3 degrees from Oxford are in biology. And furthermore, I pursued a normal biological career for some 15 years or more before getting diverted back to what always had been in the back of my mind at such time as it became technologically feasible, namely to work on what in wartime we called thinking machines, now called artificial intelligence. In last week's New Scientist, there is a discussion of Colossus's status as a computer, and Marcus Chan quite correctly, quotes Michael Smith, who quite correctly wrote that Colossus was the first practical application of a large-scale program-controlled computer, and as such the forerunner of the post-war digital computer. I think one must emphasize the as such, because program-controlled could here be misleading. It was not a stored program machine in the sense of modern digital computers, or come to that in the sense of Turing's abstract definition of computation of 1936, of which all modern computers are in some sense an implementation or embodiment, or even the world's first design for a stored program digital computer, which was Charles Babbage's analytical engine, although in fact the analytical engine was never fully operational. As far as I can determine, the first high-speed electronic stored program computer, that is a true universal electronic machine, was the Manchester Baby, which was operational in the summer of 1948. Returning to the Colossus, the sense in which it was programmable was that arbitrary Boolean functions could be programmed on a generous plugboard on the fly with the machine running, and there were some hardwired branching commands, for example, to the online typewriter. So it was possible, in spite of the fact that it was strictly a special purpose machine in the design intention, it was possible to get up to a number of tricks, some of them quite startling, to make it do things which were never intended. For example, after the German surrender, Geoffrey Timms, who with Jack Good and I was the author of the official technical documentation or history of the numerary, which was commissioned in that last summer of 1945, Timms showed that you could actually program, in a sense, Colossus to multiply whole numbers. But it was a demonstration in principle. In practice, only very elementary multiplications could be done to do with timing constants. So Colossus was special purpose in practice, but in principle not entirely. And I've said here, there are others more knowledgeable about ENIAC who may correct me. My guess is that its functionality was probably roughly comparable to that of the first American electronic machine, namely the ENIAC, at the Moore School of Engineering, which became operational in 1946. Now, there is one other way in which Colossus was made to do things for which it was never intended. The original intention, and I will recap some of this history in more detail later, the original intention was to mechanize one particular aspect at the easy end, you might say, or easier end, of deciphering fish encrypted traffic, namely, given that the patterns of the Boolean wheels, ones and zeros, finally the snake biting its own tail and being regarded as a wheel, that very elaborate combination, as we may see later, when those patterns had been successfully and incredibly laboriously broken by the hand section, that is, major tester section, then there was still the problem, which was not a breaking or research problem, but a production problem, for each new transmission, which was each new message, that is to say, which was intercepted, to discover what the initial settings of these 12 wheels actually were, breaking the settings. An enormous combinatorial task, which, following some initial investigations by Jack Good and myself using the old Heath Robinsons, Newman saw was now doable if a sufficiently powerful electronic machine could be developed. And on Alan Turing's personal recommendation, from Turing's earlier use of some electronic equipment designed by Flowers, Turing recommended Newman to go to Flowers. And the fruit of that was Colossus 1, which, as I say, was intended purely for this setting of finding the settings of the wheels. As for breaking the patterns, it was so laborious that the operation was not still, in military or operational terms, significant, because it would take days for the entire resources of the testery to break the patterns for a new link, sometimes weeks. And as I will take up again later, I had an idea, must have been in the probably early 1944, which I communicated at once to Jack Good, who saw that we could test it on the spot, whereby one could, in a quotation marks, program Colossus for the task of breaking the actual patterns. And as a result of the success of that experiment, there was then a crash program to get as many Colossuses built as possible before D-Day, and the breaking as well as the setting of the wheels became almost a factory operation, and by the end of the war we had at least 10 of these physically huge contrivances. You can go and see a rebuild by Tony Sale at Bletchley today. But the subsequent Colossuses after number 1 were successfully modified to make this process for breaking the patterns more mechanized and less human-aided. Now, going back to the basics of cryptanalysis, which will be perhaps tedious for most of you to go over the elementary basis, but to encipher a message, you take the plain text and make a combination. In this case, I've represented by the symbol plus, meaning Boolean addition. You add to it a key, and you get enciphered message or ciphertext. Now, the ideal ciphertext would be totally random, and there is no way of producing such a thing other than tapping into quantum uncertainty. However, the reason why the ideal text should at least appear totally random when put under any feasible test is that anything added to random equals random. So that you can be sure, if you add a totally random string to a meaningful message, that unless you happen to know or be able to reconstruct that enciphering key, there is no systematic procedure by which the original meaning can be recovered. To decipher, if you're in the happy position of actually having a crib and knowing what the key is simply to add the key text under this same operation of Boolean addition to the ciphertext and get back plain text. Now, by Boolean addition, I mean what is sometimes referred to as the exclusive OR in the context of propositional logic, namely add two symbols which are the same and you get a 0, so 0 plus 0 is 0 and so is 1 plus 1. 0 plus 1 is 1 and so is 1 plus 0. The exclusive OR means either the first or the second, but not both. And another way of visualizing it is to think of the rules of multiplication. If we use the symbols plus 1 and minus 1 and start doing multiplications, you'll find that 2 pluses makes a minus. Two pluses makes a plus, and so do 2 minuses. But plus times minus or minus times plus makes a minus. So that is the fundamental operation at the root of the entire Lorenz machine, or fish as we called it, traffic, based on the international teleprint alphabet, in which the fundamental physical embodiment in those days was 5-channel punch paper tape, and you have to think of the convention of the hole in a tape representing a 1 and a blank paper representing 0, which is a little inconvenient because holes remind one of zeros, but this is the other way around. So that let's just look at a case in point, and it's worth, I think, spending a little time for those who are not already familiar with these operations. Here we have a message. The fox arrived. 9 is the symbol we used for hole, hole, paper, hole, hole. Sorry, I got it the wrong way around again. Paper, paper, hole, paper, paper. That's right. And to make matters more complicated, as a matter of daily practice, we started by using X's for 1s and dots for 0s, but then Peter Hilton pointed out that it would be safer and more perspicuous always to use crosses and noughts, crosses for 1s and noughts or circles for 0. Anyway, this is the teleprint code for just move it on and don't print anything, space. And these are the teleprint code equivalents of these letters of the alphabet. That, as I said, means space. That is just blank, empty paper. So that when the receiving teleprinter machine gets this symbol, it prints out a space. Now here's some key. Let's pretend that it's random. And now we start adding. Now we can see that t plus k, since 0 plus 1 is 1, and so on, and 1 plus 0 is 1, must make a character which is all 1s. And the name we used for that was 8, and it happens to have a meaning, which is move from uppercase to lowercase. With only 5-hole paper tape, you haven't enough characters to do upper and lowercase separately, so you have to have little macros, as it were, to tell the machine at the receiving end to move up to uppercase or lowercase. Take my word for it that on the same Boolean addition principle, h plus r equals v. Check it out yourself. It's obvious that two identical symbols, if added together, must give the blank paper character, all zeros, and so on. So here we have cipher. Now the cryptographic problem is given arbitrarily large samples of enciphered text like this, and no knowledge of the contrivance which generated the key in the first place, no initial knowledge, how to build up a body of knowledge which enables you in the end to figure out exactly the total logical structure of the key generator, that is the enciphering machine, and so be able to invert that operation and go from cipher back to plain text. Now the story of the early breaks, the work of Tiltman, Arthur Levinson, Bill Tutt, is told in many different places. No better, I think, than in the Oxford University Press paperback by Harry Hinsley and Frank Stripp, called Codebreakers, which is with the subtitle of The Inside Story of Bletchley Park. So I'm not going to take time on the early history. I only came into the story anyway when Bill Tutt had got his absolutely classic and groundbreaking achievement of getting the basic logic of the machine, and that in turn arose from circumstances which are pursuing discussion, but not now. To continue the thread, as I say, anything plus random equals random. So why not have a truly random string as key? After all, you can sample some electronic noise and say here is a string which is of purely random text constructed from a quantum source. What's wrong with that? What's wrong with it is that in order to decipher the message, the receiving end has got to get hold of this key. So how does he do it? Well, you might send it to him through the mail, and indeed, in some times, in some purposes, anybody who's read the old book by Yardley, The Black Chamber, about World War I encryption, knows about one-time pads, where you equip your agent at the other end of the line with a huge pad with this genuinely random stuff, and every message he sends, he uses one pad, starting from the top, one sheet of his pad, and then eats that sheet so that it never recovered, and the person at the receiving end does likewise, remembering to decipher the message before he eats the sheet. So that's one way, but it won't do for modern times. So how about the receiving end manufacturing the key using exactly the same recipe as the sender did? Well, there is a snag about that, and that is that by definition of randomness, there is no recipe. in the algorithmic theory of information, those two expressions are the same. Random and not constructible by any systematic procedure are identical expressions. So, the reluctant conclusion is to use the best scrambling recipe that the given country's core of signals can think up. Now, I'm going to pause at this moment because some of what I say next will strike some people as surprising and other people as downright shocking. So let me prepare the ground carefully. First, let me say that what I am about to remark applies to the world up to and including 1945. But I don't wish to be construed as saying anything about the world in which we've lived since then. But up to that time, there was a simple answer to the question, how about letting the cryptographers who actually know all about randomness, approximations to it, ways of unscrambling and so on, how about letting them design the ciphers? Well, for whatever reason, that policy was not in force in Britain, nor in Russia, nor in Germany, nor in America, nor in any country in the world up to 1945 that I've ever heard of. The design of ciphers is the work of the core of signals who live in one compartment and have one chain of command. The deciphering of the messages that the other side's core of signals have enciphered or have provided the keys for enciphering, the deciphering is entrusted to an entirely disjoint professional body, namely cryptanalysts or cryptographers. This is the precondition for the great game to be continued at all. Because without any doubt, as was agreed between our people and the Germans immediately after the war when the first debriefing teams went over, if of course the key production, key generation had been designed by cryptographers, neither side would have had not the most astronomically small chance of getting into the other's traffic. So that the whole game depended on this departmentalism. And I prefer to think, and have a little evidence for thinking, that the reason for these operations being maintained, even though suicidally, in watertight compartments, was more to do with ideas about sound administration and compartmentalization of function in human organizations than anything so trivial as the desire to keep the great game going. That's only my conjecture, but I have grounds to believe, as one of my anecdotes later will illustrate, that the principle of departmental separation ran very, very deep. It ran so deep in our country that there was no possibility, except in a deniable, by some deniable maneuver, but otherwise there was no possibility of any transaction passing to do with classified activities between somebody on the payroll of the Foreign Office and somebody on the payroll of the War Office, and to form, as it were, a mixed man unit at a lower level when the lines of command didn't meet until the cabinet was just not on. Later on I'll say how we found a way around that in one case where it was critically important that we should. And everybody was happy with the solution that was found. So, one's forced back on some ingenious device like the Lorentz machine to produce pretense random material. And there's still a considerable snag because it's obviously true that anything added to almost random is itself going to be almost random. Otherwise the trade of cryptanalysis wouldn't exist. So where does the non-randomness come from, which enables ciphers to be broken at all? And the technical part, insofar as it is technical, of my talk today will be limited to simply giving you one example of how non-randomness can creep in on the plain text side, and one example of how non-randomness can creep in from the machine generation side. And if you've got a little bit of non-randomness here and a little bit of non-randomness there, there is something there to work on. But for working on it to get you anywhere, both forms of non-randomness had to be gross, so gross as to be easily avoidable, that you had to be lucky that for some reason or other the other side didn't avoid them, and also sequentially fixed by the enemy. What that means is that every time the Germans got a little anxious about the security of their ciphers, they would introduce some logical weirdness or complication into the logic of the machine. And then all of a sudden, at our end, procedures which had been working would suddenly stop working on that particular link, Berlin-Oslo or Berlin-Tunis, whatever it might be, and we were once more staring at apparent gibberish. And each time, just by our fingernails, we would creep back and be able to find out what it was that they had done. And then a little later, they get anxious again and introduce some other little tweak, which would throw us completely, but we'd struggled back, and each time we were lucky. If at any time they had introduced two tweaks or changes simultaneously, we would have been dead, but they never did. So first of all, the basic suppression of non-randomness had to be extremely poor, and secondly, the deviations from randomness had to be fixed here and there, but one at a time, leaving us plenty of time to recover in between. Otherwise, our side frankly stood no chance, and my understanding is that their side didn't actually get into the equivalent level cipher, which is, we're talking about strategic level cipher on the British side. So it was absolutely on the margin, touch and go, all the way along. Now I promised an example of non-randomness from both domains. This is from the business of generating the key. Now I've displayed the earlier sample of key that I've taken from the previous slide, and you'll have to take my word that I have just copied it across, except you'll notice that every now and then a character is duplicated. And what you saw on the previous slide has to be thought of not as a complete key, but as a component of our key, actually generated by the 5 chi wheels. But now and there were another 5 psi wheels. The psi wheels were modified by being made to stutter in a way that I'm about to illustrate, and then the result was added together, and that was the final key. But I want you to look at this stuttering. The psi wheels rolled on, but every now and then, when what we call the motor stream has a 0, that character repeats. It isn't just that the top channel repeats, but all channels repeat at the same time. So you get a complete repeat at every level. And here's another one, so we get XX. Oh, excuse me, that 0 should be an X, a 1. It's a misprint. 0SS, BBB, here we've got 2 zeros in a row in the motor stream. Well, looking at that, one has an intuitive feeling that this can't be regarded as a random string, and the quick way of making this come to light, is to perform the difference. That is to say, we make our first character in a new string by adding k to r, and then the second character by adding r to r, third character by adding r to e, and so on. If I did that to an ordinary chi stream, like I showed earlier, the result would just, again, look completely random. But in this case, wherever there is a repeat, the differenced stream now has a blank, that is, has that character, because anything added to itself is nothing, is blank tape. So that if we then made a frequency distribution count of the 32 different characters of the resulting differenced text, we would find that 31 of them had approximately equal frequency, but the one corresponding to slash, that is to say, arising from adding a character to itself, would give you a huge frequency spike. Because there's a case, there's a case, there's a case, there are 2 cases. We've already got 4 cases in a string of about, I don't know, 16, which is already far higher than the 1 in 32 random expectation. So the resulting character stream here was the psi component. That was added to the chi stream. The motor stream in turn was generated by 2 rotating motor wheels, and the total lengths of the fish codes, which collectively generated the key stream, were all mutually prime. One of them is not a prime number, but they're all prime with respect to each other. And these are the 5 lengths of the 5 chi wheels, psi wheels, motor wheels. I hesitated, thinking back 55 years, when I was constructing this, so Tony Sale will tell me whether I've made an error here, but for some reason I was unconfident. Are my psi wheels right?
Yes.
Yeah, good. It was that one that bothered me, but anyway, the smaller motor wheel repeated or preceded, controlled by the larger. You can see it's crazily complex as logic, but it has a little bit of potentially telltale non-randomness hidden in it. Okay, so much for the key and how the key generated by an apparently totally sort of pseudo-random process can nonetheless have weak points, which if they to the extent that they coincide with especially weak points in the plain text, can give you just a little fraction of a 1% statistical bulge to get hold of. Now, move over to the operator's task. Here she is, she's sitting at her probably in a mobile truck somewhere, perhaps in Germany, typing a message onto a Lorentz machine, which is enciphering it, and that's being broadcast, sent by radio or by landline. Now, I mentioned the restriction of five-channel teletape, and the fact you have to make frequent shifts from upper to lower case in order to get punctuation signs primarily. So to cause a full stop to appear, you have first to go into uppercase. So that means you have to send the character, which I call here plus, that one there. Once you're in uppercase, and you're sure you're in uppercase, you can hit M, which will now be interpreted as full stop. Now you've got to go back again into lowercase, so you'll hit this 8. And finally, you've got to put in a space. And then you start the next sentence. Now, naturally, an operator doesn't want to take any risk when typing at speed of not hitting, of thinking that she's hit, or he's hit, the uppercase, when actually it hasn't taken. Because then the operator will cheerfully go on typing, and it'll all go across in the wrong case. So naturally, the prudent operator will hit the plus and then hit plus again, and acquire the nervous habit of always doing a double upshift and a double downshift. And in fact, at the time that Tut was working on the early traffic, they used to hit it at least 3 times, up and then down. Now if we start doing this, oh yes, so what have I done here? I've done this differencing trick. I've added plus to plus, so I get blank, and then plus to M, and I get this, and that, and that. Now, add the 2 top channels, because I pointed out that with this stuttering of the psi wheels, when one channel is stuttered, they all stutter. So if we just take the 2 top channels and add them, what do we get? Nothing but zeros. So once more, a colossally non-random phenomenon has been conjured out of the abbreviated military German that the typist is typing, to such an extent that whenever a full stop appears in the tape, in the text, the delta, that is the difference, delta of 1 plus 2 is always going to be 0. And full stop is just one example. I could give you numerous examples, some from common letters of the alphabet, but others from other kinds of use of shift change in which that regularity comes out. So that, in each case, is just a fleeting sort of waving of the hand in the direction of the kinds of non-randomnesses which may be lurking, potentially, here and there, both on the key side and also on the plain text side. If you add them together, and they happen to have the same property, in this case, delta of 1 plus 2, delta of channel 1 plus channel 2 equals blank, and blank plus blank equals blank. You add them together, whenever they coincide, you're going to get a statistical blip. Well, to go into cryptographic details, anybody who has found these few remarks on the technical side stimulating to the curiosity, there is excellent documentation available which will take you most of the way. namely two reports in particular from the BP Trust by Frank Carter. Code-breaking with the Colossus computer describes in some detail the wheel setting problem and how it was solved. And this second report, also by Frank Carter, subtitled Finding the K-Wheel Patterns, what we would call chi, C-H-I, or Greek letter chi, wheel patterns, report number 4. While I'm on the subject of bibliography, there is an excellent overview of fish as well as of Enigma in chapter 19 of the book by Hinsley and Stripp that I already mentioned, the Oxford University Press paperback. There's a vivid and highly entertaining, and to the extent I can check, absolutely dead accurate retrospective account, again by Jack Good, that appears as chapter 4 of this monumental book, A History of Computing in the 20th Century. And then finally, probably for hardware engineers, the best source is Randall's chapter 5 of the same History of Computing in the 20th Century. Well, what I'm going to do now is to just take my own personal trajectory as a kind of skeleton, chronological skeleton, to hang odd reminiscences and details as they occur to me. I got into this trade during the war out of sheer muddle. I left school early because I heard through my father that you could go to Bedford and be taught Japanese and then do something romantic, being dropped in China or something like that. So I thought that's where I should be, and I went to Bedford and presented for an interview. And the officer looked very puzzled and said, who told you that we are starting a Japanese course now? So I said, well, my father, but he got it from the War Minister, actually, Sir John Grigg. So the officer said, well, I can't help that. Our Japanese doesn't start till next September. And then I felt so flattened at the thought of having to creep back to school and say I goofed it up. And he obviously perceived that I was on the verge of tears, so he cheered me up by saying that, but we do have a course, I think that was about on a Thursday, we have a course starting Monday on codes and ciphers, and if you're there at 9 o'clock, I guess we can fit you in. And that was actually how things happened during the war. It happened extremely fast, extremely informally, very much on a personal basis, and then everybody was on to the next thing.
1942, I presume.
1942.
That's
Oh, sorry. That should be 1942. Sorry. Thank you very much, Brian. This is a misprint, obviously. 1942. I think it was April or round about then. Anyway, so I started on the cipher course, and having nothing else to do in the evening, worked very hard at it and made some progress. And I think earlier than the autumn, I was, oh yes, that's right, I was recruited into codes of ciphers. Then Colonel Pritchard visited, I guess probably in May. I'd only been on the course for about 6 weeks or less, and he recruited me on the spot in the same throwaway fashion. He just said, well, here's a letter, you've got to be at Bletchley Park Gates, Delft tomorrow. Just show this to the man. And I didn't ask questions, I just turned up. So I was directed to the main mansion, which was, and attached research section while space was being made in the hut that Ralph Tester was busy setting up, getting the testery fired up. And the first thing I did was to learn how to read 5-channel paper tape. And the second thing I had to do was when a young intelligence corps officer was marched into the room, and I was told, this is Roy Jenkins, and I guess you better start by teaching him to read 5-0 paper tape. Actually, after the war, we all loyally went off to Solihull and supported him in the election. So then I moved into the testery almost immediately. In the testery, there was a ingenious hand procedure for actually, given the Chi wheels had been broken, that is, knowing the patterns, and knowing the settings for a particular transmission or message, you could add in the Chi wheel text, thus in effect making them go away, and you were left with plain language text plus the psi wheels, plus the stuttering psi wheels. And Turing, I think, had been called in just as an informal consultancy. He would have had to be clear to do so, because ordinarily you didn't ever speak to anybody in another section about your work. He must have been specifically commissioned to do this. Anyway, the procedure was already established when I arrived in the testery. It was taught to me by Peter Hilton, who was just about I think Ralph Tester's probably founding cryptographer member. And I got to know Alan Turing through getting into a mess in some Turingismus I was trying to apply, and going back to the original designer, namely Turing, to ask to be straightened out, which he duly did. But in the process of talking to each other, we made a very important discovery, important to both of us. And I have to say something now about the way that people were recruited to Bletchley Park. If you won a national crossword competition, or if you were commended as a classical scholar, or if you had distinguished yourself in the Bedford School of Ciphers course, or if you were a mathematician recommended by somebody known to the Bletchley establishment, or if you were a chess master, you inclined to end up in Bletchley Park. The result of that was that everybody in Bletchley Park was either a chess master or couldn't play chess at all. And Turing and I discovered that we were exceptions. We both played extremely bad chess. Bad enough to give each other a level game. And we were both extremely interested in the game. So we used to meet every Friday when both of us were in town in a pub in Wolverhampton, I think. Wolverhampton. And play chess. And this led on, since it was very much on his mind already, the idea of automating thought processes, into discussions of mechanizing the game of chess. And Jack Good came into it sometimes. Sometimes the three of us would go for walks together. And during those years, out of school hours, which were exceedingly few and far between in the high-pressure atmosphere, to the extent that there was spare time, the three of us spent as much of it as we possibly could on discussions to do with machine learning, or what's today called artificial intelligence. But it all started from the mechanization of chess playing as a possible and attractive bench test area. And in fact, after the war, in 1947, Turing and a Cambridge statistician, who was a great friend of his, David Champagnat, made what you could call a chess machine, if only there had been a machine around that could have written the program. So Turing called it a paper machine, and in order to find out its next move, humans had to do enormously burdensome calculation. And Sean Wiley, the algebraic topologist, who was, I think, next in the numerary after myself and I.J. Good, who I continued to know after the war, Sean Wiley and I got together thinking this Turing champ, as we call the Turing Champernoun machine, deserves a challenger. How about the Machiavelli, putting our two names together, Michie and Wiley? And so we made a hand machine, and it fell to Turing to work out, do the hand calculations for the next move from the Turing champ. And I was supposed to be the guy to do the same from our side, the Machiavelli. And unfortunately, both of us being distractible and, I don't know, one way and another, we didn't get very far with the game. And so Turing said, this won't do. And the Manchester baby was just going, by that time, going operational. So he went and talked to Tom Kilburn about the prospect of maybe he could put this, write a chess program for the Manchester machine. It got such a flea in his ear from Tom that Alan Turing, who was not skilled in or persistent in personal difficulties and relations, just sort of backed off. And that project was still born. Anyway, now Jim Wiley is a quite different Wiley. He was a professional lexicographer, so he doesn't quite fit into any of the categories that I mentioned, but I put it down because it's a sort of left a flag in my memory. We were given a special assignment on one of the occasions when the Germans introduced one of these tweaks. The Chi2 attachment, I think we used to call it, when we understood what had happened. But what had happened as far as was perceptible was that the Berlin-Tunis channel suddenly became unreadable, which was most unfortunate because Rommel was converging on Tunisia and the Americans were in the middle of landing on the west coast of Africa. And as Jim Wiley and I toiled on with this problem, more and more sort of senior-looking officers could be seen hovering around the beleaguered Major Tester, and we knew they were asking, well, can you give us any estimate? And the fact is that when you're up to your ears in that work, you can't give an estimate. You don't know what's going to happen. You're just blindly, until you're really at the wind-up phase. Anyway, that ended happily. And was almost immediately overtaken by Max Newman's, it was almost immediately after that episode that Max Newman, having decided that, I better backtrack a little. Max Newman was recruited, obviously, because he was a great mathematician, one of the great mathematicians of the century. And also, as it so happened, he was the pre-war mentor of Alan Turing. But for Max Newman, Alan Turing's paper on the Entscheidungs problem and computability would never have been published. And if anyone interested in the background can't do better than to read with some care the relevant section of Andrew Hodges's biography of Newman, Alan Turing, The Enigma. But Newman had turned up in Bletchley as a mathematician. Naturally, he joined in the testery, found to his enormous irritation that he wasn't any good at code breaking, at least at the hand procedures of code breaking. People think of intellect or intelligence as being some unitary thing which is either people are very, very bright or they're not so bright and so forth. But people who professionally study intelligence tell a totally different story, and so increasingly do the neurobiologists. People's brains are very developed in huge degree in certain very special areas and not at all in others. And there's been some, in the last few days, some stuff about Einstein from that point of view. Einstein was conspicuous at being very slow to learn to talk. He was rather poor at calculation. He was sort of average in terms of symbolic manipulation. But in the parts of the brain which sustain mathematical intuition, visuospatial reasoning, in particular the right lower parietal lobe, it's been recently announced in Nature from a reanalysis of his brain, which was preserved at his death, that those parts are very substantially enlarged, or 20% enlarged compared to the normal. Now, obviously, the little bit of the brain that was engaged at doing the testary procedures didn't have a good shape in the makeup of Max Newman. Other parts of his brain made him one of the great mathematicians of the century. So Newman, who was a driving, impatient sort of person, said to himself, well, and I know this from conversation, said to himself, well, I don't want to hang around being not very good at something. I've either got to go back to Cambridge and get on with mathematics, or I just wonder, couldn't some of this stuff be automated? And arising from his thoughts on that, some of which are preserved in manuscript, came the idea, and eventually the machine specifications for building the Heath-Robinson generation of high-speed electronic computers. Whether or not they should be regarded as the world's first high-speed electronic computers depends entirely on what you mean by high speed. If you draw the line at the right place, then the Colossus has it. They were also extremely unreliable. Jack Good and I, with the entire sort of cryptographic staff, trying to make Newman's methods work on these machines. Everybody else were Wrens and electronic engineers from Dollis Hill. Now, there followed a strange period, which was very thrilling in a way, in which Jack Good and I, and those others that we subverted into the enterprise, led a double life. Because during the daytime, Max, when he was around, was pacing up and down, saying we've got to get results, and insisting that we work on operational material. And we went through the motions of doing this, but in our hearts we knew that without a very substantial body of research-acquired knowledge of the statistics of the plain text, apart from anything else, and a systematic experimental program, the chances of making this stand up were not good. At the same time, we fully understood his position because he got the money from somewhere, and in the usual way, sponsors tend to want to see the problem solved in order to convince them that it's right to release the money to do the work to solve the problem. And that's how the world works. In any case, it's how that world was working at that moment. So what Jack and I did was, with volunteer Wrens and electronics people, we came back after late tea every day and worked into the night, collecting the statistics. So that not only we, but also the Heath-Robinson machines led a double life, doing quite different things. In the daytime, keeping the sponsors and top brass at bay, and at night laying the foundations for what subsequently happened. And that was successful. The experiments with Heath-Robinson succeeded. And it was around about that, so Newman, rightly, immediately, Newman was an extremely large-minded man. He would be the last person. I don't know if he ever discovered exactly what we've been up to, but he always went to the essential, never minded the detail, and he said, right, now we've got to do this properly. I need some super electronics people, and we'll build a real machine. And that was when he got the recommendation from Turing, and he embarked on the Colossus 1. Then the experiment that I mentioned earlier that I did with Jack Good, only took us a few hours to show that the idea was right, showed the way to pattern breaking. Then we had the crash program, and I think about 10 successor machines were operational and maybe a couple of more still being built at the time of D-Day. And it looked just like a computing shed of the mid-1950s or early 1960s, perhaps. We had 300 wrens at peak, 30 cryptographers. Our social life, when we had time for it, was accordingly extremely rich. I had the pleasure, during the making of the recent film on Bletchley Park, of getting together again with some of the wrens that I hadn't seen for 50 years. Then came the German surrender, and Jack Good was the first editor. I joined him as soon as I'd finished writing the testry history. And then when Jack Good was released, demobbed, I took over the editorship. And finally, when I got my Class B release to go to Oxford in the beginning of October, Geoffrey Timms took over and took that document, the two-volume history, technical history of the Newmanry, behind the wire. And it's believed, although the negotiations continue, are rather protracted, but it's believed that in due course that both documents will be available to historians. I'm expecting for the first time in the last 55 years or so to have the opportunity to set eyes on the testry history, which I wrote myself, and which I'm sure I will find full of surprises. And the Newmanry history, GCHQ have very kindly made arrangements for me to visit on the 2nd and 5th of July to take a preliminary look at the Newmanry histories. And I think at this point I should just stop and invite questions. It's necessarily been a very sketchy and not terribly organized quick survey of some of the my main recollections.
Astonishing. We used to think of Grace Hopper as the first programmer, but it rather seems to me that perhaps Donald really should be put in that category. Questions for Donald?
Yes.
I was very interested when you were saying about the impossibility of getting the signals people and the cryptographers to work together. But why I was a bit surprised by that, because whenever one hears about Bletchley Park, one always hears of the enormous interest that Churchill personally took in it. And that seems to me that with that, it would have been possible for the senior people at Bletchley Park to have got to Churchill and got him to make that link happen, so that you were at Bletchley Park responsible for our key.
Well, you're perfectly right in saying that Churchill could have made it happen. But first he has to receive the proposal. And we have to cast our mind back in a logical way to imagine circumstances in which such a proposal could arise and reach the cabinet. Now, the cryptographers are at Bletchley Park employed to break German codes. What is being done to develop British codes is something that the cryptographers at Bletchley Park knew nothing about, and had they done so, it would have been none of their business. So how on earth could a proposal affecting some shadowy activity surmised to be going on somewhere else within the war effort possibly have emanated from Bletchley Park?
Well, if I may say, from what you've told us and other people have told us about the eccentric nature of the people at Bletchley Park, it seems to me quite possible that somebody would, on a visit by Churchill, have actually said this to him.
No, it wouldn't have been somebody, it would have been de Grey or one of the top brass. And the top brass had a mission, which is clearly spelled out to them. They knew nothing whatsoever about what today we would refer to as Type X, which was the equivalent, the British equivalent of the German Lorentz machine. Now, if people at Bletchley Park don't even know what sort of a vague, unstructured proposal, it just doesn't, it couldn't happen.
Isn't this to some extent the division of power that this particular field always leads to because of trying to minimise the number of people who know? TRE, it was quite different. Of course, they were developing our own radars, but they had a team there whose job it was to bust our own radars, to jam our own radars.
Yes, well, it's entirely possible that there was such a team at Bletchley Park that were trying to break Type X. That's possible, but if it happened, I would be somebody who wouldn't know anything about it, because it was part of my business not to know. I mean, to this day, I know nothing about Enigma, even though I could easily pick up a book and read about it, but I just have a built-in, almost like a reflex, which makes me want to do something else. But nonetheless, I think Brian has made an extremely important point, and that is that compartmentalism, which is, although it can run riot in civil life, it can become too rigid, nonetheless is performing an essential administrative simplification function. And that's also true in wartime. But Brian is correct that where extreme secrecy is of the essence, then the already built-in thrust towards compartmentalization becomes greatly accentuated. So I think, although at first blush what you say sounds right, I just don't see it happening. What I can do, though, is to tell you of a concrete case where compartmentalism was broken down in the event by a maneuver. And it happened like this, that after Jack Good and I had been for some while in the Numenary, had succeeded with our first experiments, and now there were people like Sean Wiley and Henry Whitehead, David Rees, other mathematicians pouring into the Numenary, it became absolutely obvious to us, and particularly to me, that the impervious compartment between the testary and the Numenary was now a nonsense. And worse than that, it was an obstructive and dangerous nonsense. So I wrote out a page to that effect, took it round the section. In no time, everybody had signed it. So I put a copy on Newman's desk and one on Testary's desk. I was in a unique position, having come from Testary, so I had the passage rights back and forth. And nothing happened for a few hours, and then I got a call to go and see Ralph Tester, who took me into his office, and he was sitting behind his desk. And Tester was an extremely macho, athletic, courageous individual. And he was white as a sheet and shaking. And he said, "Good God, Donald, what are you up to? So I said, well, we all know that I proposed that we just merge the two sections. I hadn't thought about it, that meant that either Tester or Newman would lose the job, or I was at 19, hadn't seen a lot of the world. So I said, but it's getting very serious, it's lack of communication, and yet jobs are going backwards and forwards between the two organizations. We must have people. Said, I know all that, but for God's sake, don't ever, ever do anything like this again. So I said, no, I won't. Nonetheless, obviously what happened next was that the two heads must have put their heads together, because then a proposal with their backing came out, just passed around verbally. How would it be if admin develop a totally fictitious individual? Let us call him Mr. X, and Mr. X's identity will be filled in rotation by the following people: Michie, Hilton, Ericsson, Benenson, Emerson, and go around a week at a time. And Mr. X will be on the establishment of the Foreign Office and will work in the Newmanry. But since all but me were members of the testery, that meant, on this list, that meant that each of the others spent 1 week in 5 working in the Newmanry. So we all said, great. And that was exactly what was done. So I think one there sees two sides which are of the same coin, which are very illustrative of the thrilling and eternally surprising nature of day-to-day life in World War II. On the one hand, there was an incredible amount of compartmentalization, a little bit of turf wars, but nothing like civil life, because of the common cause, common purpose, comradeship and identification. But forever, ingenious extemporization to get round bureaucracy. And that was a case in point. And everybody knew, but nothing was done in writing, except there was this person called X, who probably a historian, if they crawled over the payroll of BP, they would find him. But no other annotation to connect him within any of the flesh and blood individuals who actually fill the identity.
Mark the other day on a sign on the back of a van that said, employ a teenager while they still know everything. Your entry into this world straight from school, do you feel that the freshers, the naivety which you sort of described in this event, that you brought to it was an advantage in that, and how did it work with other people at Lecture?
Well, the first thing to observe is that it was local folk wisdom that by the time you were 30, you were finished as a cryptographer. I don't know how old Turing was. He must have been about 28, so he was sort of getting on. The reasons for that, I think, I'll come back to your question about background knowledge in a minute. But first I'm going to talk about questions of temperament, emotion, motivation, which were the dominating features here. Now there must have been a reason for that. Even tennis players last longer than that. And what was it? I think it was the combination of, first you have to realize that your whole life and everything you did was the attempt to solve problems that any mature person wouldn't touch, simply because they were officially impossible. Almost by definition, we were the people hired to solve the officially impossible. And naturally, a lot of the time, perhaps most of the time, we failed. But the point is that the people who broke through put into it an intensity, a physical fitness, a vitality, and above all, a total lack of family and human connections, for the time being at least, which somebody who's married and has kids and is sort of mid-30s and so forth, doesn't bring that same white heat monomania to bear. And if he does, people start reminding him of his responsibilities to this, that, and the other thing. But nobody ever reminded us of our responsibilities. We didn't have any. We just had one responsibility, and that was to get the absolute maximum we could squeeze out of ourselves and our brains for as many hours of the 24 that we could stay efficiently awake. And I believe that going on hammering at things which anybody with any sense would have dropped is something which, in that particular age group, and particularly during the adrenaline spurt, you know, from 16 up to 25, when most of the brain injuries on the roads come from, this intense motivation is terribly important. Now, as to background knowledge, the point you've raised is of broader significance than just a Bletchley part, because in general, it varies very much from one intellectual field to another, but ordinarily, in-depth background knowledge is essential. The idea of the gifted amateur is a myth. This is the general case. And now we start looking for exceptions. The exception is if there isn't any accumulated background knowledge, or if there is accumulated background knowledge, but it is misleading because it is already out of date. Anybody who is a good enough cryptographer to be an instructor at the Bedford School of Ciphers would already have been ruined for Bletchley, because he would be hidebound with knowledge which history had rubbished. So it was actually better to start from a blank slate. And any intellectual training you had, of course. And that's why almost everybody was a mathematician. I'll come in a moment to how did I get into it in that case, or how did I survive in that case, because I'm not a mathematician. But that's a completely generic intellectual training. It's not to be confused with background knowledge. Now, Turing himself is the most interesting case, and he's almost unique, because he was somebody who, even in peacetime, behaved as though he were a cryptographer at war. That is to say, he was, to a fault, indifferent to existing knowledge. He never read up in the way other people would before he tackled a field. When he wrote his dissertation for a fellowship just before the war at King's College, Cambridge, he produced a dissertation which proved Gauss's central limit theorem. Now, Turing was so ignorant that he had never heard of Gauss's central limit theorem, but he actually rediscovered and proved very beautifully the whole damn thing himself. So that the fellows of King's had a very awkward dilemma. Do we throw this man out for being inexcusably ignorant? Or do we appoint him to a fellowship for being smart enough to... anyway, he got the fellowship in that case. But he was, in a sense, damned lucky. I said earlier that I personally don't believe that it's clear what would have happened to Alan Turing if his pre-war years, from say about 1933 to 39, hadn't been under the giant mental umbrella and diplomatic umbrella of Max Newman. Because Turing went windmilling into this problem about decidability, that Gödel had already got his category of general recursive functions, Alonzo Church with effective decidability, Coast with production systems, and all those systems, all those great mathematicians had already established the same basic result. Turing, not knowing any of that stuff, went in characteristic fashion, absolutely bare knuckled, and in the process proved the same thing all over again, but in a way which was exceptionally curious, namely, invented this mathematical construction, which we now know is the universal Turing machine, which, unlike Gödel and Post and Church, gave a beautiful mathematical and mental model for the stored program digital computer. And that couldn't have arisen from anybody who had been mathematically well-schooled and well-dressed in a way that Turing consistently refused to be. Sometimes he fell over as a result, sometimes in quite small ways. For example, during the war, this is not about mathematics at all, it's very much about Turing. In fact, most of you must have seen one or another portrait of Turing, but that was that was done about the time when he was at NPL a few years later than I first met him. But in any case, during the war, he reasoned in his characteristic way that if the Germans invaded, then anything you had in the bank wouldn't be worth anything. So why not turn your pound notes into silver bullion? And he persuaded the bank to do this for him, 2 blocks of silver bullion. He didn't tell anybody about this. He borrowed a pram from a neighbour, covering them with newspapers, pushed them into the Bletchley countryside, buried one under a stream just where it ran under a bridge and the other in Chenley Wood, and said nothing at all, because there was nothing further to be said. Except after the war, he got in touch with me, it must have been about 1947-48, because it's all very well single-handed to bury huge lumps of silver bullion, but to pull them up you need a confederate. So he offered me a choice of 2 alternatives. He said, you can have 1/3 of the loot if we're successful, option A. Option B is you can have £5 per expedition as necessary, plus expenses. So I said, I'll take the £5. Anyway, we set out, and Chenley Wood was a disaster. I said, look, didn't you make, he looked a bit vague, you see, as to where to start digging. I said, didn't you make a map? He said, I thought that would be bad security. So there wasn't much to be done. And anyway, we left it too late to do anything about the other one. So we had to have a second expedition. And he said, I know, we'll have to have a metal detector. And when I heard that, my heart sank to my boots, because I knew Alan Turing. That is to say, he had to do everything. It was a personal obsession, not relying on the shoulders, no, not sitting on the shoulders of others, but he'd have to invent and design and build the whole kind of thing, just from the ground up, in the same way as he did the universal Turing machine in the Encyclopedic Problem paper. Except with less happy outcome, because when he turned up for the second expedition, he had this contraption, and when we got to Chenley Wood, it turned out that it had a rather feeble range, not more than a foot at most, and although that might be okay for the depth at which he had possibly buried the object, with subsidence and damp soil and so forth, it wasn't realistic at all. So I got my £5 in expenses second time round, and those lumps of bullion are there today, I presume. I'm in correspondence with somebody who's providing me with aerial photographs and maps, and I've been able to identify at least a spot where there used to be a stream which ran under what used to be a bridge. But it does illustrate this mentality he had, which is a very risky one, and many times it, of course, let him down, but when he hit a button, he then hit a button that nobody else would have hit, because they would have had too much burden of preconceived knowledge. Now, how did young people make out in that? Well, the real point is that the amount of formal mathematics required for the particular job we did was very narrowly circumscribed. It could be summed up by saying that it's a combination of classical Fisherian statistics and a particular development of Bayes' theorem for Bayesian subjective probabilistic calculation, which had been developed by Turing and formalized after the war, but talked about endlessly during the war by Jack Good in a book called Probability and the Weighing of Evidence, 1950, published by Churchill, I think, but I'm afraid it's out of print. But he's celebrated for these three things: universal Turing machine, the engineering designs after the war that Simon Lavington knows a lot about here, and Donald Davis and others for practical implementation, Pilot ACE, and also proposals in the 1950 paper for use of such computers to simulate human cognition. Oh, Tony, you're not going to forget. Oh, sorry, I thought that was you in the room. These are the three things he's known for. There's something else he's not known for, but it's interesting that when Max Newman was asked what he considered to be Turing's main intellectual contribution during the war, he said it was his development of the sequential Bayes procedure. Now, we need a very short course of lectures to get across what all that was, but it was a huge simplification which lent itself to the sort of work we were doing. And speaking first of all personally, getting statistics under my belt from Peter Hilton and enough Bayesian probabilistic reasoning and elementary logic under my belt from primarily Jack Good, but also to some extent Max Newman, didn't take a very enthusiastic 18-year-old all that long to get up sufficient to speed for the job. And as far as the job is concerned, I never felt under-equipped relative to my mathematical colleagues, because we were all using the same tiny set of tools. Like if you've only just learned about golf clubs, it doesn't matter that the other people know about a million other instruments. If you're on a golf course, then those 10 or 12 tools are all you need. As for the whatever happened to sequential Bayes, Jack Good did what he should and could to put it in the public domain. It was overtaken by success because the book sold out a long time ago, and the mainstream of Bayesian probability, or in my own field, machine learning, which is now rediscovering some of these ideas, passed it by. Jack Good does in the book give full acknowledgement to Turing. I've done what I should, and perhaps not all I could, but there is a paper of mine in the Journal of Statistical Inference and Planning, which takes sequential Bayes as developed by Turing and polished and axiomatized by Good, and applies it in a rather straightforward way. It's essentially what Turing would have done if he'd done one extra step, which I've just filled in. And that is in the public domain, and I have published it. There is a rule similar to the compartmentalization rule we discussed earlier, whereby if you publish original work in the wrong subculture, the wrong literature, it isn't taken up. And sometime I ought to make amends, and to make amends properly, I would have to do probably two things. One is I would have to republish the paper in some rewritten form in the mainstream machine learning literature, so that at last people can use a rational and complete system of decision tree learning instead of all the bodge-ups which are used today. But what I would also have to do is to write a joint paper with somebody of massive reputation in the statistical inference and planning world, again saying all the same things, and giving a reference to the paper that I published. And that would see things to right. That's the best answer I can give.
Well, if there isn't any last desperate question, right, we'll just take that one and then we will.
Hello, Donald. Do you remember me? 1942, I was the engineer on Pete Robinson. When we first Is there anybody here who was on Colossus?
Yes, and
Yeah.
but,
No?
yes, I remember you clearly because you came in. I was only 19, and you were 18. It's very, he had lovely curly blonde hair, very attractive, and all the rest of it was lovely. But I have in my possession a piece of paper that Max Newman wrote to me that I would be the head of the Robinson Room.
Oh,
And that I would,
this is terribly important.
so to me that's really precious.
Yes.
I've kept it all those years in my
So you must
uniform
consider
pocket.
letting the BP Museum have a photocopy of that.
Oh,
Really, it would be a wonderful document to
yes,
put
so
up.
it's really, you can imagine how precious it is.
Oh, yes.
At the
Aha.
time I didn't, I just poked him a pocket, but later
Yes, we often refer to him as Mahan because
he was lovely. He was a lovely man.
Yeah.
To think he wrote on here, you will not, I have arranged for you not to be inoculated. You know, he, the man he was, arranged that our little wren.
Yeah,
What, I needn't be inoculated. So it's a marvellous man,
a
wasn't
great
he?
man, a very
And
great
Jack
man.
Good, nobody ever mentions, but to me, the memory of Jack Good is with a slide rule.
Oh,
We used to use slide rules in those days, and I'd never come straight from
well,
school.
I must respond to your point that nobody ever mentions Jack Good. And
And no
although-
slide rules as well.
Yes, but although we're overrunning my time, I was talking yesterday on the telephone to Jack Good, so that gives me one closing anecdote. There's no point to the anecdote except to illustrate the extremely intricate and detailed nature of Jack Good's mind, which you will remember, and a sort of literalism which continues to this day. He was reminding me of a sort of house party in a house outside Oxford after the war, when we all decided to play a game which was called the Truth Game. And our host begged us not to because he said this is very unwise, but nonetheless we all pressed on. And the rules of the game were very simple, and that is that each person took it in turn to be the witness to truth, and he was asked one question by everybody present, and everybody was sworn and pledged beforehand to answer every question completely truthfully. And he said last night on the phone, when it came to your turn, I, Jack Good, asked you a question, and you immediately resigned from the game. So, obviously, out of memory is very self-protective, our egos, and I'd clean forgotten this, so he then remorselessly reminded me and said what the question was. The question was, tell me, Donald, which question would you least like me to ask you?
So that was simply.
Can I make my point?
Oh, please.
About Alan Turing.
Yes.
You mentioned that he was a tutor, a student underneath Max Turing at the university.
Max Newman, yes.
Yeah, Max Newman. And during one of his lectures, Max said that he thought a machine would be a possible way of dealing with things like Gödel's proof and such like. And it was that idea which instilled itself into Turing's mind about machine operations for mathematical problems. Max.
That's absolutely right. Yes, you're referring to a course of lectures given in 1933 by Max Newman.
That's right.
On on the Hilbert program.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
And Turing as an undergraduate attended those lectures, and
yes.
that lit up, as you say.
And he used his, I think it was his aunt's typewriter and so on, and from all those ideas developed the Turing machine.
Thank you very much.
Well, just to wind up, can I ask Tony Sale, who of course is inevitably deeply associated with the rebuild of Colossus and the whole effort to get Bletchley Park put together as a memorial, just to say a few words.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, follow that, as they say. That's impossible. But really, I think we've had an absolutely stupendous talk here by Donald, and lovely anecdotal references to all sorts of people in Bletchley Park, and I certainly learned quite a lot about some of the people that of whom I just knew the names, and certainly it's been an absolute joy to have you here, Donald, and thank you very much indeed for coming to talk to us. Thank you.
I can't help noticing the older they get, the better they get. Yes. Just to say that our next meeting is on October the 13th, which will be dealing with punch card machinery, Hamish Carmichael and others. Is that right? If those of you who are going to join Donald and Jean at this peculiar Italian restaurant, Sego's, was it? Sugo's. Care to just sort of hang about at the back for a bit, then we'll go along as a squadron or something like that. Downstairs at Sugo's. Thank you very much.
Good.